I was getting the sign of recording, you know. This is so professional. I feel like, okay, it has been an experience, and a fantastic experience. Okay, I have a bad news. There are no more breaks, okay? And we are drawing near the end of our 15th anniversary edition of Mapping the Magazine. Let me remind you that after Joy Jenkins' keynote speech, we'll have the launch of the Handbook of Magazine Studies with the participation of the editors and authors, Migdalena Sternadori and Tim Holmes. Afterwards, we'll close MTM6 with a brief and surprise cultural moment. Not even Tim knows what I am talking about, to ensure that you leave the conference with something Portuguese in mind. It's all Teresa fault, Tim, a last hour idea. Like we had some ideas like that, as you already know. Well, this is also the last time that you are going to hear our technical instructions, okay? So here they are. Audio and video are off, not off. Are you already cut the sound? Yeah? Okay. Audio and video are off or almost off to allow for an overall better experience in terms of audio and connection quality. Please use headphones. I'm not using because the sound of the video conference don't need to have headphones. It's not because I want to do the opposite of what I'm saying. The sessions will be recorded and presentations will be made available online unless otherwise specified by the presenters. No one is allowed to record the conference unless it is their own presentation, of course. Thank you for this. And in fact, I have yet to meet Joy Jenkins in the flesh, isn't it? So to speak, I did exchange some emails with her about MTM6, but I know people that know her. Silence. They talk about Joy Jenkins using words like brilliant and amazing. And they all underline how nice she is. It is a pleasure to have her with us and to have the opportunity to introduce her. Joy Jenkins completed her PhD in journalism at the University of Missouri in 2017. She used an ethnographic case study of an award-winning USA City magazine to examine convergences between journalistic and organizational identities, as well as how notions of the surrounding community shaped the organization and its members. That's really interesting, in my opinion. Right now, Joy Jenkins is an assistant professor of digital news at the University of Tunis, Knoxville, and at the same time, she is also a research associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. Her research focused on the sociology of news, including changing organizational structures and roles in newsrooms. Joy is particularly interested in the potential for news organizations to spur public engagement, as well as gender representations in media. She has a particular interest in local media and, of course, in magazine media. Her work has been published in multiple academic journals, including Journalism Studies, Journalism Practice, Journalism and Feminist Media Studies. She previously worked as copy editor and reporter with an alternative news weekly in Oklahoma City and as a senior editor at the City magazine in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her keynote speech takes us to one of the most, if not the most, characteristics of magazines, very deeply discussed during the conference, because the title is Community Builders, Situating Place-Based Magazines in the Local Media Landscape. It takes us to the idea of the community. Joy is going to pay special attention to the challenges and opportunities facing these specific magazines, particularly in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. It really closes the academic circle of MTM6 perfectly. And I thank you very much for you being here. As usual, you can send all your comments and questions through our chat, and at the end, Joy will answer them. It's time to listen to Joy, please.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that. And thank you so much to the Mapping the Magazine team for having me here today. I attended the 2016 conference in Sydney as a graduate student, and it was just one of the most fantastic conference experiences I'd had. I just love the opportunity to engage with magazine scholars from various countries and backgrounds, and a chance to get feedback on my dissertation at the time. And I'm going to share some findings from that with you all here during my presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get the presentation going. All right, can you all see that okay?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Well, great. Well, today, as Carla mentioned, I am excited to talk with you about a particular genre of magazines, place-based publications. I have studied city and regional magazines in the US context for the last 10 years. I added that up in my mind considering graduate school and everything, and it's hard to believe, but been studying it for a few years now, and it's been fascinating to learn about the development, growth, and adaptation of these publications to emerging trends in the media landscape. And of course, because they're local magazines and part of the local media ecosystem, they've been subject to many challenges that is facing local journalism and local news organizations right now. And I'll be talking about that as well. So for a little bit of context here, around the world, legacy media continue to grapple with the shifts resulting from the move to a digital, mobile, and platform-dominated media environment. More and more news organizations are turning to subscriptions and paid content models in their efforts to enhance digital earnings in the face of a continually declining advertising and subscription revenue market. And they recognize the importance of forging stronger and deeper connections with online audiences, such as through podcasts, emails, and mobile alerts. And according to the 2020 Digital News Report from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, which is fresh off the presses, if you haven't checked it out, I definitely recommend it. Countries such as the United States and Norway have seen significant increases in payment for online news, with smaller rises in many other markets. However, those subscriptions tend to go to a few large national brands, which of course neglects a lot of those smaller titles. And further, those who pay for online news, which still represents a minority of online audiences, say they're drawn to content that is distinctive and of high quality. Legacy media are also grappling with a social media environment in which users are increasingly turning to private messaging apps for sharing and discussing news. Trust in the news has also declined overall. According to the Digital News Report, only 38% of respondents said they trust most news most of the time, and concerns remain about the relationship between social media and misinformation. And of course, with all this in mind, local media often face even more acute challenges. And here I pulled a few recent headlines spurred by the pandemic talking about local news, particularly in the US context. So threatening local papers, newspaper revenues drop, US newspapers and The Guardian face extinction level crisis. And so you can see the way the discourse is going in terms of the future of local news. And the local sector has long felt the implications of ownership consolidation and losses in advertising and subscription revenues resulting from the rise in digital consumption, leading to reduced publication frequency, shrinking newsrooms, and in some cases, outright closures. Research has chronicled these trends and the rise of news deserts and ghost newspapers, as Penny Abernathy called them, in countries like the US, and there's been research in the UK as well, and examining how the loss of these local outlets affects the social, political, and economic fabric of communities. And although half of respondents, or nearly half of respondents in the Digital News Report said they were very or extremely interested in local news, and most said they would miss it if it were gone, reaching young audiences remains very difficult for many local outlets. And local outlets, although they tend to fare pretty well in terms of trust, they're also increasingly competing with other local information sources. So places like local Facebook groups, political parties, local enterprises, schools, and churches. Of course, the global COVID-19 pandemic has caused even more strains on local media. Many local outlets have seen unprecedented traffic levels as audiences seek credible information about where they live, but some predict that 2020 could be the worst year yet for local media, which are facing losses in advertising and event revenues, declining newsstand sales, halted deliveries, layoffs and furloughs, and increased consolidation and even some closures. Local magazines have not been immune to the challenges presented by the rise of digital media and competition for advertising dollars from platforms such as Facebook and Google. In the early 2000s, city and regional magazines in the US context drew ample advertising dollars, with some running at over 300 pages each month. However, in the wake of the 2008 economic downturn, print advertising, which is the primary revenue source for most titles, plummeted, and revenues from digital editions and online advertising did not compensate for the losses, according to an article in the Columbia Journalism Review. As a result, city and regional magazines have pursued alternate revenue streams, such as custom publishing and events, while leveraging the appeal of their print editions. As alternative news weeklies in many cities continue to decline, city magazines also offer in-depth lifestyle coverage, shopping, home, dining, healthcare, real estate, and long-form journalism that might not be available anywhere else. The rise of the pandemic has disrupted this mission, of course, both editorially and financially. In March, the Time Out Group suspended the print editions of its 40 city-focused magazines worldwide, and San Diego Magazine, which is one of the earliest city magazines, I'll talk about it more in just a minute, laid off most of its staff, according to an article in Folio. Facing lost advertising from closed businesses, some city and regional magazines have shifted to digital coverage, and others, such as D or Dallas Magazine, had to resort to pay cuts and layoffs. And I'll talk more about D Magazine in a minute as well. City and regional magazines have also adapted their coverage, moving from the hottest bars and restaurants and events around town to business closures, event cancellations, social distance activities, and how to adapt to life at home. Some have also offered information about where to get tested and highlighted local heroes and ways to serve the community. And I pulled, you can see here, a couple of covers from city magazines around the US showing some of the ways they've adapted their covers to be able to address the pandemic. We have 21st Century Plague here in Atlanta, Leadership in Boston. We Will Get Through This in the Washingtonian magazine. And if you look across city magazines in the US, you see some really interesting visual messages that their covers have been demonstrating. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of city and regional magazines in the US context, because that's where most of my research has focused. And then later on in the presentation, I'll talk about local magazines in the UK context. But in the US, these functions, blending in-depth reporting with high-minded lifestyle coverage focused on a city or region, have defined city and regional magazines throughout their history. In the US, geographically defined magazines have existed since Boston Weekly magazine was launched in 1743. Honolulu Magazine began as Paradise of the Pacific, which was founded by King Kalakua in 1888 under a royal charter. And this periodical, interestingly, resembled contemporary city magazines in its focus on serving as an ambassador at large, emphasizing positive characteristics of the Hawaiian Islands to attract tourists. We also have Baltimore Magazine, which was established in 1907 and also says it's the oldest magazine in the US. So of course there's some definitional questions there over which one was actually first. But there's a long legacy of these publications in the US. However, the magazine that served as the launching pad for the nationwide growth and expansion of city and regional magazines was San Diego, which began in 1948. And I have one of the early issues of San Diego here on the left, where it was talking about home design and had some really great photos of some decor during that period. And this magazine sought to serve as an alternative to other local media, particularly local newspapers, which was a reasoning cited by several city magazine finders in the coming decades as they began to spread. And after World War II, city magazines developed as a response to demographic change, with people around the country migrating to cities and suburban areas. Most of these publications, as Riley and Selno described, served as, quote, urban survival manuals for the relatively affluent, guides to the best shopping, the best dining, the best entertainment that a city had to offer. And some city magazines, such as those founded by local chambers of commerce, maintained a largely positive tone, serving as guides to the best of their cities. Others focused on offering investigative journalism, tackling topics ranging from overcrowding in larger cities to unemployment, to increases in pollution, to crime and urban decay. In his work on urban media, Gene Bird said that city magazines in the 1960s represented part of the, quote, alert urban press because they crusade for, as well as boost civic morale and appeal to a rather small, quality-minded elite who are influential in urban decision-making and move across political boundaries in the metropolis. Bird also suggested that some articles in city magazines showed depth and perspective that was lacking in other media coverage of urban issues. By the late 1970s, 187 city and regional magazines were published across the United States, and their popularity could be attributed to people wanting to know more about their communities, as well as readers' dissatisfaction with local newspapers that, according to Hayes, failed to provide insight into the changing lifestyles of an educated, sophisticated urban readership. They also had a focus on content instructing readers where to spend their increased leisure time and money, and an audience that appealed to advertisers. So kind of a perfect combination of things to be able to ensure their success at the time. Over the next few decades, city magazines continued to inform, entertain, and provide advertising to cater to affluent readers. However, as Miriam Greenberg argued, many city-focused media brand their cities as a means of reaching middle and upper-class consumers. In doing so, these publications might gloss over negative historical events and current challenges facing communities to maintain positive perceptions. Therefore, many city magazines, she said, have replaced coverage of controversial topics and in-depth reporting with more of an emphasis on advertising and entertainment. She said they've also become increasingly standardized in terms of editorial and advertising content. And this is something that you can see if you look across some city magazine covers, and they're all doing, you know, best bars or best restaurants, and it's difficult to distinguish what particular place-based context they're emerging from. So a few statistics about city magazines today. So now city magazines, according to a 2018-2019 report from the City and Regional Magazine Association, reach nearly 4 million readers each month collectively. Readers are largely female, about 58%, with a median age of 45. Most of them are college educated. They also have an average household income of $192,000 and are 2.5 times more likely to be business owners, partners, or corporate officers. So that affluent, highly educated audience that has distinguished these publications since they really started to proliferate. Scholars have suggested that city magazines can complement the reporting of newspapers and provide alternative voices on city issues, including, as Ernest Hines described, defining problems, recommending solutions, and building consensus for action. Hines also said that city magazines that successfully mix serious reporting and commentary with guides to leisure time fun can exert influence and provide service far beyond their numbers. And this is something that we can still see. City magazines in some cases have filled in the gaps as local newspapers decline. For example, as reported in Folio, Louisville Magazine, and I have a cover from Louisville here on the right, is providing coverage in the wake of deep cuts at its local newspaper, the Louisville Courier-Journal, which has shifted from in-depth reporting to online breaking news. And in its place, Louisville Magazine has stepped in with in-depth coverage of local issues. In 2013, the magazine produced a 36-page feature highlighting the need for investment in the Weston neighborhood, resulting in new local initiatives and businesses and investment in economic and social programs. And more recently, the magazine published a cover story on the disproportionate amount of Black teens charged as adults. And that's the striking cover here on the right. That's the story that goes with that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my research on city and regional magazines from the content perspective, as well as from the perspective of editors who produce it. So first, as we know, and as we've been talking about throughout this conference, magazines are distinctive among other types of mass distributed publications in their ability to, as Reader and Moyse described, construct meaning about the collective identity of the communities they serve. In the case of city and regionals, this collective identity is rooted in a sense of place. That is, in choosing the people and places that they deem important and deserving of their time and attention, editors at city magazines can contribute to how readers perceive and understand their cities, states, and regions. However, because city magazines cater to that well-educated, affluent, and upwardly mobile readership, as well as the advertisers seeking to reach this demographic, their depictions often support class and culture-based assumptions about urban life. And an analysis of lifestyle content, coverage of city issues, and opinion and commentary pieces across 5 award-winning city magazines in the US, I found some of the limitations of presenting a more sanitized version of city life in the pages of these publications. Overall, content prioritizes elite affluent audiences with disposable income, such as through an emphasis on experiencing cities through consumption, raising awareness of city issues important to the upper class, and sharing perspectives to which privileged citizens could relate. These magazines relied on rhetorical devices common among magazines, such as using we all and you to unite readers, but these strategies also assume that readers represented the same socioeconomic backgrounds and experiences. As a result, while discursively uniting one community, these magazines also segregated another. For example, the city magazines featured topics such as fashion, restaurant reviews, and weekend travel guides, encouraging readers to experience their cities through consumption. Events coverage often emphasized highbrow offerings such as the opera, fashion shows, nonprofit events, and luxury vacations. And home features, which are a staple of this genre, I have an image of a home feature from Memphis Magazine here in the middle, showcased opulent mansions and extensive remodeling projects. But rather than presenting them from an outsider looking in perspective, the articles offered guidelines for how readers could emulate these projects. Food coverage highlighted gourmet meals in the best restaurants with more lowbrow fare indicated by taglines such as cheap eats and steals. And those were presented more as a new dining experience rather than an option when money is tight, which is more the reality for many people in these communities, I imagine. Similarly, readers could use their purchasing power to explore new cultures, such as through visits to Thai, African, Indian, Mexican, Korean, and other eateries. You can see here in Indianapolis Magazine's Global Eats issue, which is a fairly common type of feature, with magazines offering tips for what to try and how to overcome language barriers when interacting with staff, which of course also assumes a certain kind of community that's engaging with this coverage. Other techniques were evident in coverage of local issues, such as using a humor-driven approach that addressed issues in a way with which readers could identify, but that did not necessarily challenge their conceptions. For example, the Kicking Ash feature in Indianapolis Monthly, which I have here on the left, described a new smoking ban and identified winners and losers in the smoking ban. Winners included restaurant servers, for which they said the best part is not having to wash your hair after a shift, and losers included pickup artists, quote, the old standby need-a-light is pretty much out the window. This approach presented the issue in a more digestible way for readers, but not necessarily for those who might directly be experiencing the impact of this ban. Features also highlighted the efforts of elite individuals to address challenges, such as a doctor helping the working poor, a U.S. attorney focused on human trafficking, and nonprofits working to address issues such as healthcare, environmentalism, and challenges facing at-risk youth, an approach that favored elite sources and subjects rather than those affected by these issues. And ultimately, through focusing on personality profiles, lifestyle content, and overall lighter fare, the city magazines tended to emphasize the positive aspects of cities, where to eat, live, shop, and spend time, and ignored some of the more challenging aspects of city life. As a result, these publications construct images of cities that appeal to readers and may represent how they perceive their hometowns, but it does not necessarily address the reality of life in an urban environment, particularly for those from marginalized communities. These depictions also carry deeper implications, particularly the lack of diversity evident in topic areas, sourcing, and photographic subjects. People of color were often relegated to short profiles, such as LA archetype in Los Angeles, or city scene in Memphis, and inside information in Cincinnati. But these features favored sports coaches, business leaders, chefs, or other high-status individuals. As a result, the magazines missed opportunities to highlight others with important stories. Additionally, a feature in Memphis, which I have highlighted here, highlighted a white developer who rejuvenated blighted neighborhoods mostly occupied by poor African-American citizens. Although the developer described the neighborhood as consisting of, quote, poor Black, mostly retired folk, the author did not address whether those residents were driven out in light of the area's rehabilitation. The developer also said he faced cultural challenges in that, quote, even Black folks don't renovate Black neighborhoods. It's an odd cultural thing that I didn't grow up with and don't understand. This source suggested that he could not identify with the residents' disinterest in renovating their homes and took it upon himself to transform their neighborhood. The author didn't counter this statement with facts addressing whether the source assessment was true. Rather, the quote was presented as a problem to which white affluent readers could relate. As a result, city magazines missed opportunities to explore topics that might challenge dominant understandings. This can also limit city magazines' position as agenda setters that can identify challenges facing cities and suggest solutions. But city magazine editors, interestingly, are often aware of these tensions as they navigate competing interests in their work, including the need to appease not only their publishers, but also staff members, sources, advertisers, and readers. And in doing so, they balance a public service focus on advocating for their cities with a private service focus on advocating for their magazines. In-depth interviews with 11 editors at city and regional magazines in 10 states revealed how these editors balance their perceived journalistic obligations with institutionally determined motivations, as well as the perceived influence of readers, all while managing market demands and presenting sellable content to appeal to advertising representatives and clients. Overall, many editors in the study sought to provide content reflecting the positive attributes of their cities and that would improve readers' lives. One editor said, "We give our readers information that helps them live well and take advantage of everything the area has to offer." And although editors described similar motivations in terms of reflecting their cities in a positive light, a tension arose between fulfilling that somewhat public relations-oriented function and a more journalistic emphasis on improving their cities through coverage. And we can see that in a quote from one of the editors here who said, "We don't really delve into anything too political here. That's just not what we get into. It's more just things that people can act on and do to get out and sort of improve their life." And that was a narrative that occurred among several of the editors. When editors did pursue more negative stories, they ensured that the criticism was warranted and helped the city progress. As one editor said, "My big thing is just making sure that there is a point. Are we just being mean? Are we calling someone a name or poking fun?" And there's a fair amount of that, but we're trying to steer away from that. Some editors said they limited content because it would not sell. Although these editors identified a topic as interesting, they did not recognize the monetary value in pursuing it. One editor described this negotiation as juggling and that people won't buy the magazine if it isn't useful or interesting. Another quote that I really appreciated from this that was really interesting is the second one, where an editor said, "You can't preach unless you get them inside the church," essentially saying that we can do those harder issue types of stories, but we can't necessarily put them on the cover. We need to put something more appealing on the cover, and then we can share the more issue-oriented coverage inside the magazine. Editors also discussed a tenuous relationship with service content, which some said they feel obligated to publish, although they might prefer to emphasize more hard-hitting stories. Editors noted that in the case of city magazine fixtures such as Top Doctors, Best Restaurants, and Super Lawyers, service sells, with one calling service journalism the backbone of many city magazines. This prioritization of these features year after year, however, could also grow monotonous, causing editors to feel locked in or editorially limited, which we can see from this quote here. "We didn't get into journalism necessarily to write about 100 best restaurants or the best spa in town, but it's necessary." I don't want to call it evil because it's not evil, but it's a necessary part of it, especially in magazine journalism. Another editor said that he puts harder hitting stories on the cover over the course of the year to, quote, "occasionally sort of put on the front door to remind people that you're more than just restaurants or more than just Top Doctor." Editors also discussed a higher purpose for city magazines, which they thought should represent and elevate a city while taking a long-term view on trends in their communities. Even those associated with magazines with a more lifestyle-oriented focus said they desired to publish more investigative articles. Often, the focus on this type of content was connected with an editor's personal desire to use their journalism to make a difference in the city. Editors expressed a desire for readers to feel smarter about their cities as well as a result of reading magazines, which could manifest in dialogue and perhaps even taking action. One editor said he hopes that his features spur conversations about issues and people and current events, which could lead to readers sharing ideas publicly, and maybe that'll continue to push our city further, this editor said. The editor of Philadelphia, whose cover is here on the screen, described a feature on race that spurred a city and nationwide discussion. And this editor said that they took on an admittedly sensitive topic, but the author had something provocative to say about it, and if you approach it in the right way, people will pay attention. What's interesting about this particular feature is that it was later denounced by many as racist when it was published in 2013, and in 2015 the magazine came under fire again when it ran a cover story, a guide to local public schools, without any Black students in the cover image. And just last month, the editor-in-chief of this magazine resigned in an effort to ensure more newsroom diversity. So showing some of the different types of things that these editors are dealing with and thinking about their coverage and thinking about inclusion. When private service content did achieve public service aims, it helped readers learn about new ways to enjoy their cities, thus fulfilling magazines' organizational missions while offering environments to sell advertising. As such, editors could justify this content as serving multiple needs. It's appealing to readers while driving revenues. And we can see in this final quote here, I think through this content, you can shape how people see their own cities, maybe see things they wouldn't have seen without us being there. And that might be in a more positive way, in a more valuable way. And that's a way to keep people feeling connected to something. And that sense of connection, of course, has been a theme throughout this conference, but also something that these editors really value. Some city magazines extend their interest in effectively blending public service and private service content to leading efforts to create tangible change in their communities. D, or Dallas Magazine in Dallas, Texas, was founded in 1974 by Wick Allison and Jim Atkinson to serve as a strong, independent city magazine and alternative to the local newspaper, the Dallas Morning News, allowing advertisers to target a burgeoning, influential, affluent market, which the founders referred to as the leadership class. And that's a term they still use to describe their ideal readership. The flagship magazine D now has a circulation of nearly 61,000, and publications within the company have expanded to include D Home, a shelter magazine, D Weddings, D CEO, and DMagazine.com. The company also created D Academy to educate, quote, members of the creative class in Dallas on the workings of the city. That was designed to reach more up-and-coming leaders within the community and educate them about issues in the Dallas area. That program was discontinued in 2016, but it was relevant for these findings, which I'll talk about here in a minute. In February 2015, Allison, the publisher, and other city leaders and urban planners launched Coalition for a New Dallas, which is an initiative aiming to restore and reconnect neighborhoods affected by elevated highways. The program focuses on educating residents about Dallas's declining urban core and promoting opportunities to remove and reroute the highways in question. A super PAC was also created to build awareness and elect sympathetic city councilors. And D considered itself as more than a magazine, but as an innovative, forward-thinking media brand. The magazine was actually at the forefront of digital development in the world of city and regional magazines, and several others looked to it to see what it was doing with its website and with blogs and with other multimedia elements. Editors emphasized the traditional journalistic aspects of their daily work, such as planning and editing content and working with writers. They also completed company-required tasks that blurred those lines between editorial and marketing functions, such as developing new products, working with staff members in non-editorial departments, attending fundraisers and parties, and hosting businesses and networking events. But interestingly, they still continue to draw a discursive line between their editorial and their more marketing or PR-oriented roles. And we see that in this first quote, that this was from one of the editors at DCEO, a business magazine targeting leadership at local businesses, that said, "We fulfill a very traditional editorial role, but also product development. We do a lot more than most editors typically do in terms of keeping an eye on sales and everything, but it never infiltrates our coverage." And that discursive boundary was something that came up among several of the editors. And Dee's mission was and still is making Dallas even better, which staff members discussed as part of their understanding of the local function of the company and their organizational roles within it. For some, that mission manifested in Dee Magazine's approaches to editorial decision-making. For others, it represented a more general understanding of how Dee covers issues and the company's local reputation. And for still others, it offered a frame for considering the company's influence. In particular, multiple staff members praised the fact that Dee stakes an ideological claim on issues in a way other news organizations might not be able to do. Dee staff members emphasized the magazine as a, quote, media of opinion. Dee's internal organizations were also cited of examples of the way the company influences the city, particularly Coalition for a New Dallas. Staff members suggested that although they were not required to get involved with that coalition, supporting the cause reflects company culture. An editor with the website said, as a hardened old newspaper journalist, I did and everyone else did have some concerns about how the coalition thing is going to affect our editorial autonomy, but it wasn't a problem at all. A management team member said she enjoyed working in a company with clear goals. And we see that in the second quote. I love that I have a boss, in this case, the publisher, who was like, we're going to tear down the highway, and there is no doubt that it will happen. Tearing down a dilapidated highway was one of the main goals of the coalition in order to spur urban development. Staff members also frequently invoke the interests of their readers when discussing the perceived influence and success of their work. They describe Dee's audiences in terms of the company and its brand as a whole, as well as their particular publications such as Dee Weddings or Dee Home, and the audiences and communities they serve. These characterizations also allowed staff members to differentiate Dee's readers from those of other publications in the city. For example, an editor with Dee Magazine, the flagship publication, compared his magazine's audiences to readers of Vanity Fair or The New Yorker. He said, we have a sophisticated, very educated audience. 99% of them have a college degree, so we're not writing to the Observer's audience. In this case, the Observer is the alternative news weekly in Dallas. And this suggested that Dee reaches a different readership from the Observer, while also suggesting that Dee's readers were refined and required higher quality content. I have another quote here from another editor at Dee who said that our readers are affluent, engaged folks who have lived in Dallas for a while. So I mean, if you're going to find a crime story, we're not going to do a crime story just about some drug dealer who shot somebody. It has to be it's got to be elevated. If you've got a jewel heist, okay, now we're talking. And this comment really reinforced the way conceptions of audience influence news values at Dee's publications, and that a crime story about, quote, some drug dealer might be considered newsworthy at the local newspaper, but because Dee Magazine serves an upscale audience, the crime must affect or be of interest to those affluent elite citizens, in his words, elevated. The use of elevated, which could describe sources, articles, photography, design, readers, allowed editors to justify choices about content while reflecting a consumerist influence on reaching the right readers who can affect change in the community. And ultimately, this all reflected the city magazine mentality that was evident across these studies, which functioned as a legitimizing discourse, allowing staff members to reinforce companies' ability to provide thoughtful and deeply reported content alongside service-oriented content while reflecting Dee's authoritative role in the community, and through suggesting how readers should live their daily lives and the types of causes they should support. And to finish up, I am going to transition just a bit to some research I've been doing the last few years with the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. And through this, I've been able to broaden this research on US local magazines to consider how local and regional news organizations around Europe are adopting their editorial and business strategies to meet audiences' needs in a media environment that's increasingly digital, mobile, and shaped by platforms such as Facebook and Google. And here's a report called The Digital Transition of Local News, which we published 2 years ago, and which is available on the Reuters Institute website. But we found that interviews with reporters and managers and editors and business managers at 8 local and regional news organizations in 4 countries, that there are 3 overall strategies through which these outlets are producing and monetizing local news in the digital age. And this is something we can think about in the context of local magazines as well. And the first is a national scale approach. And this is an approach that emphasizes economies of scale pursued through acquiring a portfolio of different titles that in the aggregate can draw the largest possible audience, which is in turn primarily monetized through advertising. And this was an approach that was most evident among national parent companies in the UK that own a lot of a lot of local newspapers. The second was the regional breadth approach, and this was an approach that also emphasizes economies of scale, but it focuses on developing a more focused portfolio of editorial and other offerings in a particular region. And these local publishers monetize their position in these regions through paid content models and auxiliary forms of revenue, such as events, which of course have been challenged in the pandemic, services, e-commerce, and others. This approach was evident in large regional companies in France, Germany, and Finland, countries that have long sustained a robust local and regional press. And finally, the local depth approach. This was an approach that was pursued by individual local titles and groups, and those owned by smaller parent companies. And these are organizations that remained financially and editorially powered by their communities and regions, reporting on smaller geographic areas, and in many cases relying exclusively on local advertising and print subscriptions. But like larger groups, they're looking to sustain themselves through other types of revenue sources, premium content, subscriptions, events, and things of that nature. So I'm going to conclude by talking about a project that I'm just getting started with, but I wanted to share some preliminary findings, and I definitely welcome your feedback and questions about this. But in addition to those local and regional newspapers that I talked with for the report, I wanted to look at some local and regional magazines as well, to see how these overall trends that different companies are pursuing to digitize these publications, how those might be evident in strategies among local and regional magazines. So I started with some interviews in the UK, and I've been conducting interviews with editors at local magazines that represent different genres and business models, including some recently launched independent titles, some longtime regional publications, and a set of magazines owned by one of the largest publishers of local newspapers and magazines in the UK. And I spoke with the editors about similar themes as in that report. So challenges and opportunities, newsroom structure, editorial strategies, business models, and digital distribution. And some common themes emerged among these titles. First, editorially, the editors said that they aim to positively highlight the places and people that made their communities desirable and unique. They focused on producing uplifting and positive human interest stories, even during the pandemic, such as focusing on stories that offer a sense of escapism for readers. Staffs of these magazines were often small, sometimes consisting of a single editor. The magazines emphasize the importance of a distinctive, well-designed, and beautifully photographed print product, which of course is something we've been talking about the last few days. And they describe the print product as an experience for their readers. Editors also desired for more diverse and inclusive coverage and audiences. And while legacy magazines tended to reach an older audience, the newer upstart magazines connected with younger readers, which goes to a point we were discussing about this morning with reaching younger readers. And some of the magazines were free, some were paid. All were reliant on advertising, which took a hit during the pandemic. They're also experimenting with alternate revenue streams, such as events, at least pre-COVID. And digital strategies varied from an emphasis on creating daily website content to full digital editions that are available online, to a reliance on social media posts to connect digitally. And some were experimenting with newsletters, video, and podcast. And they also described social media as a useful tool for analytics to understand their audiences better, sharing photos and stories, and building community. Editors also potentially saw their magazines as more sustainable than local newspapers, in that they have a built-in base, readers with a desire for print, uplifting content, and they also said they had more autonomy in decision-making as editors. And I'm going to share just a couple of case studies here of a few of the magazines whose editors I've talked to. The first is the Archant County magazines. And these are regional magazines that include 18 local lifestyle titles across different counties in the UK, such as Cheshire Life, Yorkshire Life, and Dorset Magazine. And most of the publications are overseen by a single editor, although some include deputy and assistant editors. And Liz Nice serves as the head of content for these titles. And these magazines reach an older, more affluent audience. They focus on people, places, and property with an emphasis on beauty and luxury. And although editors have access to content from a central hub, such as stories on fashion, retirement, beauty, homes, and motoring, NICE encourages them to ensure that their covers allow readers to instantly recognize the county. And editors, they've had to adjust their editorial strategies in the midst of the pandemic, focusing on picturesque images and the travel, shopping, and dining that readers can do after the pandemic. And advertising has also declined, but there have also been some new advertising clients that have emerged. And I said, and I have the quote here, that it's really about hope, because people feel a little bit like, oh, nothing good is ever going to happen. But we're saying soon these things will be reopening. So it's just about giving readers something to look forward to. She also said the primary challenge facing the magazines now is to become more digitally focused. And she's working to show editors the potential of digital for advancing their editorial strategies and helping them reach new readers. And in contrast to the long lead time required for a print issue, she said digital is reacting to what's happening now, but it also is a place for long reads. And she said that's something people will do online. And she said a digital focus can also improve the print product, and that when you put something online, it has to be really sharp. You have to have a good headline, so it avoids magazine articles that are vague or woolly. And a digital presence also allows editors instant knowledge about what people care about. Another example is the Dalesman, and this is a regional magazine established in 1939, and it has since been joined by several other titles, Cumbria, The Countryman, a wildlife conservation magazine, Down Your Way, which is a nostalgia magazine, and the Lakeland Walker, which is a walking magazine in the Lake District. And the Dalesman draws about 12,000 monthly subscribers and 20,000 sold copies, with an audience comprised primarily of older readers. Editor John Stocco, who took over just last fall, said the magazine's take an old-fashioned approach to editorial, publishing some long-held features such as a cartoon character called Old Amos, who's been present since the first issue, as well as human interest stories, personal columns, how-to guides, travel and mystery stories, and letters from readers. And Stocco said it's a light read, which is part of its charm. It's something completely different. You can switch off the news, you forget about the problems of the world, and it's just there to put a smile on your face. He also said he's working to enhance the visibility and sales of the magazine, although the large number of subscribers has helped to insulate it from some of the closures that are occurring during COVID. And although these issues are primarily focused on the print edition, Stocco said he aims to develop a stronger digital strategy, such as using social media to connect with both existing and new readers. And he said, you can see the quote here, that in comparison to local newspapers, he feels that they have that personal touch, they understand their readership, and so we're miles ahead in that way.
I'm sorry, I lost the hour because it's 6:18, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and speed ahead to the conclusions. But this is also the Circus Journal, which is an interesting example, an independent quarterly magazine based in Bath and Bristol, part of a stylish lifestyle media brand that's aiming to reach young creatives and celebrate like diverse, inclusive, celebratory, and realistic stories, supported by ads with free distribution. And then lastly, the Doncapolitan, which is in Doncaster, Yorkshire area, and it started as an arts project and became a print magazine covering local arts and culture, and then shifted to an online publication in December 2019. They're also doing some experimentation with co-creating news with local citizens and really just showing the beauty of the community in contrast to the ways national media might cover this city. So, so I'll leave the conclusions up here to look at, and look forward to taking some questions.
I'm deeply sorry. Thank goodness.
No, that's okay.
No, I'm sorry, because when I saw Milena entering, I'd look at my phone, mobile phone, good Lord, it's 10 minutes. Very sorry. We have some questions here for you. The first one is from Teresa Mendes Flores. She says, we used to be taught as students that Western journalism was oppositional and that the East countries of Russian influence had a positive and propagandistic journalism. This must be nuanced, Joy. Joy, how do you see this question? Is a positive journalism propaganda or not at all? This goes to the old-fashioned question about newspapers, journalism, magazine journalism, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, it definitely does. And that's it's a really interesting question. And I think I've seen different perspectives. So looking from kind of the textual analysis type approach, I've seen this emphasis on positive coverage compared to boosterism that is really only focused, at least in the US context, on the economic development of communities, focused on supporting the elite and supporting dominant ideologies. And so it doesn't really challenge those as a way of addressing, you know, bigger problems or structural issues. But when you talk to editors and ask them about it, there's some interesting kind of tensions that arise there. So some of them said, yes, we know it's mostly positive. You know, sometimes that feels limiting, but ultimately we want to give our readers something to be proud of. We want them to see their cities in a positive way. In some cases, these are communities that might not get covered very much, or maybe they've lost some of their local media. And so they want to represent that positively and provide kind of an antidote to maybe other more negative coverage that maybe newspapers might emphasize. And so it's kind of it's a challenging thing in that some of them maybe do want to pursue those types of stories, but they feel like their readers just want a respite from some of that when they're reading their local magazines.
Good news do exist and positive news do exist.
Right.
News too. I have two questions from Jair, so I'm going to read both, and then I pass to Sharon, that is in the middle, that made an answer Magnus in the middle of the two from Jair. So the first one of Jair is the myth of local magazines and newspapers. A move increased by the current pandemic creates what is being called news deserts. In its absence, there is a tendency by the readers to search for local information in bubbles, but in social media groups as well as message apps. Do you believe this process can be reversed?
Yeah, that is such a good question, and it's definitely true. So as I mentioned in the digital news report, they have a whole section on local news this year, which is great. And one of their findings was that people are increasingly turning to these other information sources in their communities because their local newspaper is closed or they don't have access to local information. So they may be going to local Facebook groups around shared interests, or maybe focused on their neighborhoods, going to the Twitter feed for the local police station, you know, going to these other types of outlets. And so that's, you know, a major challenge. But I think, you know, it's hard to predict whether it can be reversed. But what I'm hearing from editors at these upstart local outlets is that people are hungry for local information that's credible, that's interesting, that's distinctive, that's high quality. And if they can create that and make that available, you know, people will come to it. There's still, you know, questions around how long people will pay for it, of course, and that's a major challenge. But that last example I had, the Docopolitan, they're really interesting because they're actually grant funded. They got an Arts Council grant to do their work. And so they see that as a way to keep producing distinctive local information without having to worry about advertising.
Well, the Jair has another one, as I told you, but for instance, Sharon Magnus has a question that is related to this one, because she asks, do you think the print magazines will resurface, or is this the end for them? Another old question.
Yes, that old question. Again, what I'm seeing is a resurgence in that's really, really interesting, and maybe not, you know, at the mass scale, but there's some interesting kind of new print magazines emerging. So Circus, which is the magazine I mentioned toward the end, it's in Bristol and Bath. It's in print. They do have a digital edition. You can read the entire thing on their website, but they're really focused on having a really beautiful print product, and they say that young readers desire that there's almost a pivot back to that for this audience that they're seeking to reach, which is an audience interested in craftsmanship and beautiful things and creating things with their hands, those kinds of things. And so there are some kind of communities popping up at the local level who are interested in these print magazines. I don't know if that means like a mass, you know, revisiting of print, probably not, but it does offer some opportunities to think about what makes a magazine that people want to hold on to because it offers something they want to keep. And so I think that's something that creators are thinking about.
Thank you. And the second one from Jair, how has the current US polarized political scenario changed the magazine's agenda?
Oh, that's interesting. So how's political change the magazine's agenda?
She had it at the local level.
At the local level, yeah. That's interesting. I haven't looked at that explicitly in terms of politics. I have seen just in kind of research over the last few years that, of course, you know, as we know, magazines tend to take a point of view, have a particular ideological perspective. And at least at D Magazine, you know, they were pretty open about the fact that, you know, we have an opinion and we're going to share it and we're all pretty much on the same page. And if somebody's not on the same page, we're going to talk about it and figure it out. And so they felt, you know, pretty empowered to challenge maybe, you know, conservative local leadership, to challenge the powers that be, to try to get, you know, their focus and what they think their city should do out there, which is interesting because the publisher at that magazine is pretty conservative. And so there may be some different kind of agendas happening there, but they feel like it's important to take a stance on things. And I haven't seen whether that plays out in other local magazines, but that's a really cool question that I want to look at.
Okay, thanks, Joy. Now you have a question from a person that you don't know, Pedro Geronimo. And he asks you, in the USA, there is a strong sense of community. How do you see the engagement of local magazines with their communities?
How do I see, sorry, say that, I'm trying to find.
The engagement of local magazines with their communities.
Yes, great question. So there's a heavy emphasis on engagement, and that's something that, at least in these UK magazines, the editors really, really privileged and really spoke as being an important priority, that they want to have a tangible presence in their readers' lives. The editor at the Dalesman in particular said that he's constantly taking calls and talking to his readers. He shared a story about one of his older readers who was feeling really, really lonely. And I forget how, I think she sent a letter to the magazine saying, you know, when I get the magazine in my mailbox, it helps me feel connected. And he was really struck by that. So we sent her some flowers, and they ended up having a phone conversation. And he said, you know, that really shows that our connections go beyond the page. Our connections are real and they're tangible. And that's something that those at these, you know, more locally focused magazines really emphasized. And of course, you know, like when you look at some city magazines in the US context, there still is a reliance on these, you know, imagined audiences and these idealized audiences and challenges of figuring out how to, you know, respond to all the Facebook comments and those types of things. But when you get more and more local to hyper local, I think those connections are very real and something that they feel like will help sustain them.
Thanks a lot. Magazines are magical. Just more, okay? This is from Tim Holmes that asked you, following on from Pedro's questions, and this one that we have just answered, can these magazines keep themselves above the political fray in an increasingly polarized society? What do you think?
That's a great question. I don't think they want to, actually. And at least in some of the editors I've been talking to, like, for example, at the Donkopolitan, Rachel Horn, who's the founder of that publication, said, you know, we're an activist publication. We want to take a stance on things. When Black Lives Matter protests were happening or events were happening in their community, she said, we're going to write stories about it. And they connected with a local citizen who came from a mixed race background. They had him share a story about the racism he'd experienced it, and they put it in his words, you know, on their website. And same thing in terms of environmentalism and supporting the artist community. With that publication, they felt like, you know, we are part of making change, and to do that, we need to take a pretty overtly activist stance. And so I think that, yeah, I think that's something interesting that some of them just really embrace.
Thanks. And the last one is came from our Mary Yogurt, and she asks you, do you think that is important that local magazines in the UK, and I will add all over the world, including Portugal, have a high quality luxury feel?
Yeah, I think it depends on the audience and the goals. I think so. Some of those magazines that aim to be aspirational, to have, you know, beautiful pictures of the landscape and homes and fashion and those types of things, you know, having that high quality luxury feel fits the editorial philosophy. But the ones that are maybe more like that are oriented toward a different type of goal, maybe more of an activist goal or more of a, I don't know what some of the other options may be. They may want to take a different approach. They may want to go solely online or operate through, you know, social media or operate through an audio type of thing. And so all these different approaches, of course, challenge the definition of magazine, which is something that, you know, we've been grappling with the last few days. And so, so those magazines in the UK, like the Archant publications, they pride themselves on having that high quality luxury feel, but some of the more, you know, artsy magazines or some of the activist ones, they take a different approach.
Thanks a lot. So the answer is it depends.
It depends. That's always the answer.
So we are on time, 5:30. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Joy, for this enthusiastic keynote. It was really, in the chat, my Portuguese colleagues we are all discussing what we are going to do about the Portuguese scene and to know more. So it was really inspiring. And now we go directly to the book launch of Tim and Miguel, okay?